Welcome to Audible Archives. I'm Rob, your host and narrator tonight, bringing you a tale rewritten by Raul with the same chills, charm, and cunning that Agatha Christie herself stirred into quiet corners of English life. In this story, superstition meets cold calculation, a frightened invalid, an angry husband, a mysterious fortune teller, and a blue flower that should never be blue, all woven into a puzzle that only Miss Marple can untangle. Settle in, because in the Blue Geranium, every whisper matters, and every detail hides a truth waiting to bloom. Sir Henry Clithering paws of his wine glass half raised, the beginning of a sentence hanging unresolved between them. "When I was down here last year," he began, then he stopped abruptly, as though realizing he'd stepped onto fragile ground. Across the table, Mrs. Bantry tilted her head, pen poised over a guest list, curiosity bright in her eyes. The retired Commissioner of Scotland Yard was spending a quiet weekend at Gossington Hall, and she'd been very pleased to enlist his counsel on a mundane but socially perilous dilemma of who would make a sixth at dinner. "Yes," she prompted, leaning forward. "Last year." Sir Henry hesitated, then asked with an odd gravity, "Tell me, do you know a Miss Marple?" Mrs. Bantry stared. "Know her? My dear, who doesn't know Miss Marple? The very picture of the old-fashioned spinster. Quite sweet, but hopelessly behind the times." "You don't mean—" She blinked. "You like me to invite her to dinner? You sound surprised." "A little," she admitted. "I wouldn't have thought she—" "Well, perhaps you'd better explain." Sir Henry set down his glass with a soft clink. "The explanation is simple. When I was here last year, we got into the habit of discussing unsolved mysteries. A sort of intellectual game. Raymond West started it. He's a novelist, you know. Each of us brought a real case, one we personally knew the answer to, and the rest would try to deduce the truth. And," she prodded. He smiled ruefully. "And, like characters in an old yarn, we barely realized that Miss Marple was listening. Of course, we were very polite about it. Didn't want to hurt the old dear's feelings." He paused. "But now comes a jest, my dear Mrs. Bantry, the sweetest joke of all." He leaned in conspiratorially. "The old lady beat us every time. Every single time." "What?" "Straight to the truth," he said, like a homing pigeon. Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows shot up. "But that's extraordinary. Miss Marple has hardly ever been outside St. Mary Mead." "Precisely," said Sir Henry. "And according to her, that's exactly why she's so good. She says village life gives one unlimited opportunity to study human nature under a microscope." Mrs. Bantry considered this, reluctantly impressed. "I suppose one might at least learn the small, petty side of people, but I don't think we have any real criminals here. Still, perhaps we should try her on Arthur's ghost story after dinner. Heaven knows I'd be grateful for an explanation." Sir Henry lifted an eyebrow. "I didn't know Arthur believed in ghosts." "He doesn't. That's what makes the whole thing so distressing. It happened to his friend George Pritchard. Quite the most prosaic man alive. It's rather tragic for poor George. Either the story is true or else—" She stopped. "Or else what?" Sir Henry asked quietly, but Mrs. Bantry only shook her head, choosing not to finish. After a moment she murmured, as though to herself, "You know, I like George. Everyone does. One can't believe that people do the most extraordinary things." Sir Henry nodded, wearing an expression that suggested he knew, far better than she, just how extraordinary people could be. The dinner gathering, and so was that later that evening, Mrs. Bantry found herself glancing around a chilly dining room. only feel a tiny thrill of anticipation as her eyes landed on the upright old lady seated at her husband's right. Miss Marple, small, delicate, wrapped in wisps of lace and old-fashioned dignity. Lace mittens, lace fichu, lace crowning her soft white hair. She was chatting earnestly with Dr. Lloyd about the workhouse and the suspicious inefficiencies of the district nurse. This, thought Mrs. Bantry, this spry little relic, the terror of unsolved mysteries. She almost suspected Sir Henry of orchestrating some elaborate joke, but there was no twinkle in his eye, no hint of mischief. Her gaze moved to her husband, dear, broad-shouldered, red-faced Colonel Bantry, deep in conversation about horses with Jane Hellyer, the actress whose beauty seemed to glow like soft lamplight. Jane's great blue eyes widened ceremoniously every few moments. Really? Oh, fancy! How extraordinary! She hadn't the faintest idea what a fetlock was, and cared even less. Arthur, Mrs. Bantry called across the table with a laugh, you're boring poor Jane to distraction. Leave horses alone, Arthur. Dolly Bantry called teasingly from across the dinner table. Tell Jane your ghost story instead. You know, George Pritchard. Colonel Bantry looked up, startled. Dolly? Oh, I don't know if Sir Henry wants to hear it too, she insisted. I told him a bit this morning. It will be interesting to hear what everyone thinks. Jane Hellyer clasped her hands dramatically, a sparkle of delighted fear in her luminous blue eyes. Oh, do, she breathed. I adore ghost stories. Colonel Bantry hesitated, rubbing his jaw. Well, I've never been one for supernatural nonsense. He paused, frowning into the firelight. But this? A hush drifted across the table. I don't suppose any of you knew George Pritchard. A better man never lived. His wife, well, she's dead now, poor woman, but while she lived, she never gave George an easy hour. He inhaled sharply, as if remembering years of someone else's torment. She was one of those permanent semi-invalids. I dare say something truly ailed her in the beginning, but whatever it was, she certainly made the most of it. Capricious, exacting, forever dissatisfied. Poor George ran about after her like a servant, and everything he did, every word, every movement, was always wrong. Most men would have put a hatchet to her years before. Dolly nodded vigorously. She was an awful woman. If George had murdered her with a hatchet, and there were any women on the jury, he'd have been acquitted on the spot. Colonel Bantry nodded. Exactly. He settled back, gathering the threads of the tale. I don't quite know how this particular business began. George was vague about the details. But Mrs. Pritchard had always been fond of mystical crowd, fortune-tellers, palmists, clairvoyants. She collected them the way some women collect teaspoons. George in mind, so long as it kept her amused. But she'd get irritated with him for not rhapsodizing over her spiritual revelations. That was another grievance. A few sympathetic smiles went around the table. And then there were the nurses, Bantry continued. A whole procession of them through the house. Mrs. Pritchard usually tired of them within weeks. One young nurse, Carstairs, I think, was absolutely besotted with fortune-telling. For a time, Mrs. Pritchard adored her. Then suddenly she turned on her, demanded she be packed off immediately. Jane gave a tiny gasp, as if drama pleased her almost as much as beauty. After that, Bantry said, they brought back an older nurse, one who'd dealt with Mrs. Pritchard before. Nurse Copeling. Sensible, calm, the sort who could handle a neurotic patient without losing her own head. Miss Marple gave a small nod of approval at the name. She seemed to know the type. Now then, Bantry went on. Mrs. Pritchard always lunched upstairs, and around lunchtime George and the nurse would decide who was free for the afternoon. Technically, Nurse Copeling was off duty from 2 to 4, but she was obliging. If George wanted an afternoon out, she'd sometimes take her break later. He paused. Well, on this particular day, Nurse Copeland mentioned she was going to see her sister in Golders Green and might be late returning. George's face fell. He'd arranged a round of golf. Laughter murmured through the table, but she reassured him. Will neither of us be Mr. Pritchard, she said. Then she added with a twinkle, your wife is expecting more exciting company. More exciting? George had asked. Nurse Copeland's grin widened. Let me get the name right. Zarita, psychic reader of the future. Groans erupted at the table. Oh, dear, said Dr. Lloyd. Colonel Bantry chuckled. George had exactly that. Lord help us, another one? Apparently Nurse Carstairs, the mystic-loving one, had recommended Zarita before her dismissal. Mrs. Pritchard had been eager to try the new prophetess. At least I'll get my golf, George said cheerfully, and went off feeling unreasonably fond of Zarita, simply for being scheduled at the right hour. But, Bantry said, leaning forward, when he returned, he found Mrs. Pritchard in a state of terrible agitation. The flames crackled. The room seemed to lean in. She was on her invalid couch as usual, waving smelling salts at her nose like a battle flag. George, she cried, what did I tell you about this house? The moment I stepped inside it, I felt something was wrong. Didn't I tell you? Colonel Bantry imitated George's weary patience. George swallowed the temptation to say, you always do. Instead, he said, I don't remember that. Jane Hellier gave a quiet laugh, and she fired back, you never remember anything that concerns me. Men are callous creatures, but you are more insensitive than most. Bantry shook his head slowly. Poor George. He said that was when the real trouble began. Come now, Mary dear, that's hardly fair, George said gently, but Mrs. Pritchard was already winding herself into a fresh storm of indignation. As I was telling you, she insisted, this woman, this Zarita knew at once. The moment she stepped into the room, she actually blenched. You know what I mean? And whispered, there is evil here, evil and danger. I feel it. George very unwisely laughed. Well, you certainly had your money's worth this afternoon. His wife closed her eyes, lifting her smelling salts dramatically. How you hate me, George. You would jeer even if I were dying. I don't hate you, Mary, he said helplessly. After a theatrical pause, she continued, you may laugh, but I shall tell you everything. This house, this very house, is dangerous to me. She said so. George's passing fondness for Zarita evaporated instantly. He knew too well how swiftly Mary could seize on an idea and insist on uprooting their entire life if she chose. And what else did she say? He asked warily. She was too upset to say much. Trembling, actually trembling, but she pointed at my violets, those violets on the table, and cried, take those away. No blue flowers. Never blue flowers. Blue flowers are fatal to you. Remember that. Mrs. Pritchard pressed a hand to her chest. And you know, George, how I've always felt that blue is repellent. I have a natural, instinctive warning against it. George was far too wise to point out that he had never once heard her say such a thing. Instead, he said mildly, what did this Zarita look like? Mrs. Pritchard brightened. This was a kind of question she lived for. Black hair, she said, down in huge coils over her ears. Her eyes were half closed, with great black rings around them. She wore a black veil over her mouth and chin, and she spoke in sort of singing voice. Foreign, Spanish, perhaps. In other words, said George cheerfully, the usual stock in trade. Mrs. Pritchard immediately closed her eyes again. I feel extremely ill. Ring for nurse. You know how unkindness affects me. 2 days later, Nurse Copeland came to George with grave expression. Will you come to Mrs. Pritchard, please? She has received a letter that has upset her greatly. George found his wife on her couch, clutching a scented sheet of paper. She held it out with trembling fingers. "Read it," she commanded. The paper reeked of perfume. The handwriting was large, sweeping, and theatrical. "I have seen the future. Be warned before it is too late. Beware the full moon. The blue primrose means warning. The blue hollyhock means danger. The blue geranium means death." George was halfway through an incredulous laugh when he caught sight of Nurse Copeland. She made a small, sharp gesture. "Don't." He cleared his throat instead. "The woman's probably trying to frighten you, Mary. And anyway, there's no such thing as a blue primrose or a blue geranium." Mrs. Pritchard burst into tears. "My days are numbered. I know it. You don't care. You never cared." When he and Nurse Copeland slipped out onto the landing, George exploded. "What utter nonsense!" Nurse Copeland hesitated. Her calm face looked oddly uneasy. "I suppose it is," she said. Something in her tone made George stare. "Nurse, surely you don't believe?" "No," she said firmly. "I don't believe in fortunes. That's all nonsense. What puzzles me is the motive. Fortune tellers usually want something. But this one, she frightens Mrs. Pritchard and gains nothing. Why? What's the point?" She paused. "And there's another thing." "Yes." "Mrs. Pritchard says something about this Arita seemed familiar." "Well," Nurse Copeland shook her head lightly. "I don't like it, Mr. Pritchard. That's all. I didn't know you were so superstitious." "I'm not, but I do know when something is fishy." It was 4 days later, Colonel Bantry said, that the first real incident occurred. But to explain it properly, we must describe Mrs. Pritchard's room. "Oh, let me do that," Mrs. Bantry cut in. Her eyes shone with the authority of someone who knew her wallpapers. It was paper with one of those new designs. You know the sort, where you apply clumps of flowers to make a sort of herbaceous border. The effect is quite charming, like being a garden. Though of course the flowers are all wrong. They could never possibly. "Dolly," Colonel Bantry interrupted gently, "don't let your passion for horticultural accuracy run away with you." Sir Henry gave a dry little cough. "Most unscientific." "Quite," Colonel Bantry agreed. "Now to proceed." Mrs. Bantry sighed dramatically. "Very well. Only remember, you all know I'm an enthusiastic gardener. That wallpaper was an abomination. Bluebells, daffodils, lupins, hollyhocks, Michaelmas daisies, grouped together like schoolchildren forced into the same class. Absurd. Dolly, let Arthur tell the story," Sir Henry said gently. She subsided, muttering, "Still absurd." Colonel Bantry resumed. "One morning, Mrs. Pritchard rang her bell so violently that the whole house flew upstairs thinking she was dying. Far from it. She was pointing at the wallpaper with absolute horror. And there it was, a single primrose blue. Jane Helier shivered in delight. "Oh, how creepy." "The real question," the Colonel went on, "was simple. Hadn't the blue primrose always been there?" George suggested it. Nurse Copeland suggested it. But Mrs. Pritchard refused to hear of it. She insisted she had never seen it until that very morning. And it had been a full moon the night before. Mrs. Bantry inserted, "I met George that day. He looked worried, really worried. I called on Mrs. Pritchard and tried to laugh the whole thing off, but she was trembling, terribly upset. I left her room, feeling genuinely concerned. Not long afterward, I ran into Jean's toe and told her the whole business." She paused, recalling the moment vividly. "Jean is a rather queer girl. Very cool, very blunt. When I finished, she asked only one thing. So she's really upset about it." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "I said the woman was perfectly capable of dying of fright. She was that abnormally superstitious." And Jean looked at me quite calmly and said, then perhaps it might be all for the best. Jane Helier gasped softly. Oh, yes, quite dreadful, Mrs. Bantry agreed, still scandalized. Jean said it so matter-of-factly. I was shocked, but she went on. What use is Mrs. Pritchard's life to her? None at all. And it's hell for George. To have his wife frightened out of existence would be the best thing that could happen to him. Miss Marple nodded serenely. One always wonders. Colonel Bantry sighed. Dolly, please let me continue. Toward the end of the next month, the colonel said, Mrs. Pritchard became more and more agitated. She marked the full moon on her calendar, as solemnly as if she were marking her execution date. On the night itself, she called both Nurse Copling and George into a room. She made them inspect the wallpaper carefully. Hollyhocks everywhere, pink, red, white, but not a single blue blossom. Then, Mrs. Bantry added, she locked her door for the night. And in the morning, Jane Helier said breathlessly, a blue hollyhock? Close, said the colonel. A single flower, high above her pillow, had turned blue. It shook George, Bantry admitted. I mean, really shook him. And naturally, the more shaken he was, the more determined he became not to take it seriously. He insisted it must be a practical joke. He ignored the locked door. He ignored the fact that Mrs. Pritchard herself discovered the change before anyone else, before even Nurse Copling went in. He dismissed the whole thing as nonsense. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes bright. But I remember the look in George's eyes when he told me. He wasn't frightened, not exactly. He was confused, like a man who knows there must be an explanation, but can't imagine what it could be. Miss Marple folded her hands. And that, she said gently, is always the most dangerous moment in a mystery, when a mind refuses to see what is standing right in front of it. George Pritchard was not a man easily shaken, but the blue hollyhock had struck him like a hammer blow, not because he believed in psychic warnings. George was solid, stubborn, sensible, but because it made him feel unreasonable, uneasy in ways he couldn't give voice to, and the feeling only worsened when he discovered his wife wanted to leave the house. He refused, bluntly, almost harshly. He was becoming pig-headed. Colonel Bantry said dryly, George usually gave in to her, but not this time. Something in him rebelled. Perhaps the whole business frightened him more than he'd admit. Perhaps he thought, quite wrongly, that Mary was playing some kind of trick. Whatever he thought, the weeks crept on, one moon phase at a time. The calendar in Mrs. Pritchard's room acquired an almost sacred significance. She repeated the old warning like a mantra. The blue primrose, warning. The blue hollyhock, danger. The blue geranium, death. And she lay staring at the wallpapered clump of pink-red geraniums nearest her bed with morbid fascination. Even Nurse Copling, sensible, brisk Nurse Copling, began to look worn around the eyes. 2 days before the full moon, she came to George Pritchard with her composure fraying. Mr. Pritchard, please, take her away just for a night or two. George flared up. If all the flowers on that damn wall turn into blue devils, it couldn't kill anyone. It might, the nurse pleaded. Shock has killed people before now. Nonsense. And that, Colonel Bantry noted, was George all over. You can't drive him. He digs his heels in. Harder the push, harder the resist. The night of the full moon arrived quietly, almost ceremonially. Mrs. Pritchard locked her bedroom door as usual. She appeared calm, eerily calm, almost exalted. Nurse Copling wanted to give her an injection of strychnine, a stimulant. Mrs. Pritchard refused. She was, in her strange way, enjoy herself. Colonel Bantry said. George insisted on that. Even Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, there are people who relish their own tragedies. The night passed without the usual violent ringing of the bell. At 8:30, with no sign of her stirring, the nurse knocked. No reply. She fetched George. He hammered on the door. No sound within. With a chisel and effort, they forced a lock. "One look at her was enough," said Colonel Bantry quietly. She lay very still. The doctor later said she'd been dead at least 8 hours. The room was silent, airless, motionless. On the bed, her smelling salts bottle rested loosely beside her hand. On the wall, just inches above her pillow, when the pink-red geraniums had turned a vivid, unnatural blue, Jane Helier shuddered. "Oh, horrible!" Sir Henry Clithering's brows drew down thoughtfully. "No additional details?" Colonel Bantry hesitated. His wife supplied what he had forgotten. "The gas," she said. Sir Henry turned sharply. "What about the gas?" When the doctor arrived, he smelled it. Faintly, he found the gas ring in the fireplace ever so slightly turned on. Barely. Not enough to poison anyone. The nurse noticed a smell when she first entered, Mrs. Bantry added. George said he smelled something, that it made him feel queer, but he blamed shock. Anyone would. Sir Henry murmured, half to himself, "A gas ring, slightly open, and that," Mrs. Bantry said, "wasn't the end." Rumors began to spread. Whispers among the servants. They had overheard things, dangerous, damaging things. Mrs. Pritchard accusing her husband of hating her, saying he would jeer if she were dying, accusing him, dramatically, of wanting her gone. Worst of all, she had said loudly, to anyone who would listen, "When I am dead, I hope everyone will realize that you have killed me." And as ill luck would have it, Colonel Bantry said gravely, "George mixed weed killer for the garden the day before. One of the younger maids saw him take up a glass of hot milk to his wife afterward." Sir Henry made a low, skeptical sound, circumstantial, but capable of misinterpretation. "Precisely," said Bantry, and misinterpretation was rife. Within weeks, the gossip swelled so loudly that Scotland Yard had no choice. An exhumation order was issued. Colonel Bantry's voice dropped on the word, and a cold hush settled around the table. Even Miss Marple looked up sharply, blue eyes keen over her lace fichu. "Yes," Sir Henry murmured. "Indeed, that is where matters become interesting." The room had fallen into that loaded silence that always comes just before a truth is forced into daylight. Sir Henry's voice broke it. Slow, grave, deliberate. "The autopsy found nothing," he said. "A case, for once, of smoke without fire." Mrs. Bantry frowned thoughtfully. "The whole thing is really very curious. That fortune teller Zerida. When we tried to trace her, the address was fake. No one had ever heard of such a person." Her husband added dryly, "She appeared once, quite literally out of the blue, and then vanished the same way." He paused. "Out of the blue. Rather fitting considering." "And Nurse Carstairs," said Mrs. Bantry. "Everyone assumed she recommended Zerida, yet she swore she had never heard of her." The circle exchanged uneasy glances. "A mysterious story," murmured Dr. Lloyd. "One can form theories, yes, but not certainty." Miss Marple, who until now had been quiet, lifted her head. "Has Mr. Pritchard married Mrs. Toe?" They all turned toward her. Sir Henry's brows rose. "Now, why?" he asked gently. "Do you want to know that?" Miss Marple opened her mild blue eyes. "It seems to me so important," she said simply. "Have they married?" Colonel Bantry shook his head. "We expected something might happen, but it's been 18 months, and they hardly see each other now. That," Miss Marple nodded, "is important, very important." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Then you do think the same as I do? You think, Dolly," her husband warned, You can't accuse people without a shred of proof. Oh, don't be so manly, Arthur. Men never once say anything. Anyway, this is all private. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. I've wondered, just wondered, if Jean Instow disguised herself as the fortune teller. Not to harm anyone, mind you, perhaps only as a joke. And Mrs. Pritchard, well, she might have been foolish enough to frighten herself to death. Isn't that what you meant, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled gently. No, dear, not quite. The room tense, everybody listening. You see, she continued, if I wouldn't kill anyone, which of course I never would, because it would be very wicked, and I don't like killing at all, not even wasps, though the gardener assures me he does as humanely as possible. She paused, lost her train of thought, then blinked. What was I saying? Sir Henry prompted, amused. If you wish to kill someone? Oh, yes. Well, if I were wicked enough, I should never rely on fright. People rarely die of fright, you know. The most delicate invalids are much braver than they appear. No, if I were committing such a dreadful act, I should want something definite, certain, a thoroughly good plan. Sir Henry laughed softly. Miss Marple, you terrify me. I pray you never take a dislike to me. She looked at him reproachfully. I thought, I made it clear I'd never contemplate anything so wicked. Colonel Bantry leaned in. You were putting yourself in the place of a certain person. You mean George Pritchard? I'll never believe it of George, Mrs. Bantry said quickly, though the nurse believed it. I went to see her after the exhumation. She wouldn't say anything, but she was convinced George had something to do with it. Well, said Dr. Lloyd slowly, perhaps she wasn't so far wrong. A nurse may have no proof, but she often knows. Sir Henry folded his hands. Come now, Miss Marple. You've been thinking. Tell us. Miss Marple startled, then blushed faintly. Oh, yes. I was just thinking about our district nurse. Such a difficult problem. More difficult, Sir Henry pressed, than the Blue Geranium? Miss Marple considered. Well, it depends on the primroses. The primroses? Mrs. Bantry echoed blankly. Yes, you said there were yellow and pink primroses on the wallpaper. If a pink primrose turned blue, that fits perfectly. But if it had been a yellow one, she shook her head. Oh, dear, that would never do. It was a pink one, Mrs. Bantry said. She stopped. The others stopped. Everyone stared at Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded. Then that settles it. Miss Marple shook her head with a soft sigh, the lace on her cuffs trembling, and the wasp season and everything, and, of course, the gas. Sir Henry leaned forward, his tone dry but curious. It reminds you, I suppose, of countless village tragedies? Not tragedies, Miss Marple corrected gently, and certainly nothing criminal. But it does remind me quite a lot of our trouble with the district nurse back home. Nurses are human beings, after all. Force appears so proper. Those stiff collars, all the rules, living so closer with family. One mustn't be surprised if, well, things sometimes happen. A spark lit in Sir Henry's eyes. You mean Nurse Carstairs? Oh, no, said Miss Marple calmly. Not Nurse Carstairs. Nurse Copeland. She glanced around the table with that deceptively mild expression of hers. You see, she had been in the Pritchard household before, and she had been, how shall I put it, quite thrown together with Mr. Pritchard. You've all said he's an attractive man. I dare say she thought, well, we needn't analyze her hopes too closely. I don't think she knew anything about Miss Instow at first. But afterward, when she did find out, well, that would naturally turn her against him. Strong feelings often do. So she tried to do as much harm as she could. And the letter really gives her away, doesn't it? Sir Henry blinked. What letter? Miss Marple clasped her mittened hands. Well, she pretended to write to this fortune teller, at Mrs. Pritchard's request, and lo and behold, the fortune teller arrives, apparently in answer to that very letter. But later we learn no such woman existed at that address at all. So Nurse Copeland must never have posted it. She only said she had. Far more likely she dressed up as the reader herself. Sir Henry let out a low whistle. I never saw the point about that letter, but yes, that's vital. Quite bold of her, really, said Miss Marple. After all, Mrs. Pritchard might have recognized her despite the disguise. Still, if she had, the nurse could always say it was a harmless joke. Sir Henry narrowed his eyes. When you said that you would never trust a fright, what did you mean? Miss Marple looked apologetic, almost shy. One could not rely on fright alone. It's terribly uncertain. So I believe, if one were a wicked person, the blue flowers and the ominous warnings were simply camouflage, a distraction, and the real method? Sir Henry asked quietly. Miss Marple took a breath. I know I have wasps on the brain, she admitted. Such poor creatures, destroyed in their thousands, usually on the loveliest summer days. She paused, then continued thoughtfully. But I remember the gardener mixing cyanide of potassium in a bottle of water, and thinking how very like smelling salts it looked. And Mrs. Pritchard was always sniffing at her smelling salts. You said they were found right beside her hand. A hush fell over the table. So if one put cyanide solution into a smelling salt bottle, Miss Marple continued, and substituted for the real one, well, the poor woman would use it as usual. While Mr. Pritchard went to telephone for the doctor, the nurse could quickly switch the bottles back, and she would turn the gas on just a little, enough to hide the almond smell, in case anyone noticed something odd. And, you know, cyanide leaves no trace at all after a little time. She paused again, looking modestly down. But I may be wrong, she added softly. It may have been something quite different in the bottle, but that hardly matters, does it? Jane Hellier leaned forward, entranced. But the blue geranium and the other flowers? How did she do that? Nurses always carry litmus paper, don't they? Said Miss Marple innocently. For testing, well, bodily matters, not a very pleasant subject. Her eyes twinkled. And dabbed on wallpaper flowers, it can make colors change very prettily. Miss Marple gave a prim little nod, her cheeks blooming to a delicate pink. We won't dwell on it, she murmured. I've done a little nursing myself. Then, with the air of someone explaining an embroidery stitch, she continued, blue turns red with acids, and red turned blue with alkalis. Quite elementary, really. A small patch of red litmus pasted over a red flower, particularly the one nearest Mrs. Pritchard's bed, would do beautifully. And when the poor woman lifted her smelling salts, she paused, her eyes sparkling. Well, ammonia is a most powerful alkali. It would turn the patch blue immediately. Ingenious, really. There was a stunned silence around the table. Oh, and of course, she added, as if remembering a loose thread, the geranium wasn't blue the instant the door was broken open. Nobody noticed anything unusual until afterward, when Nurse Copeland switched the bottles. She would only need to hold the sal ammoniac close to the wallpaper for a moment. Sir Henry let out a low breath. You might have been there yourself, Miss Marple. She looked genuinely distressed. What troubles me, she said softly, is poor Mr. Pritchard and that nice girl, Mrs. Stowe. Likely each of them believes the other guilty, keeping their distance, and life is so very short. She shook her head with gentle sadness. You needn't worry, said Sir Henry, leaning back with a thin smile. I've been keeping something up my sleeve. There's been an arrest. A nurse. Charged of murdering an elderly patient who left her a tidy legacy. Cyanide of potassium substituted for smelling salts. Exactly the same method. He paused, letting it sink in. Nurse Copeland tried it again. So Mrs. Toe and Mr. Pritchard need not suspect each other any longer. Miss Marple brightened instantly. "Oh, isn't that lovely?" she said. "Not the new murder, of course. That's dreadfully sad. But at least the truth will be clear now." Then she folded her mittens primly in her lap. "And it does show," she added gravely, "how very wicked the world can be, and how far one may fall if one gives in temptation even once. Which reminds me, I must finish my little conversation with Dr. Lloyd about our own village nurse." She rose with gentle dignity, a small, lace-framed figure whose shrewd blue eyes had once again seen straight to the puzzle before anyone else even understood its shape. You've been listening to Blue Geranium, narrated and hosted by Rob, and rewritten for Audible Archives by Raul. If you enjoyed unraveling this eerie little mystery, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us bring more classic tales and clever twists straight to your ears. Until next time, keep your wits sharp, your lamps low, and stay listening.